Thank you, James. So first of all, I just want to say that we are learning about expanded access. Our own thinking about this topic is evolving. So today I'm just going to provide an update and sort of a few comments about where we started, where we're headed. And again, all of this is very much work in progress because as a community, we are learning how to best apply EAPs or expanded access protocols to our studies. So first of all, the reason we are having this conversation at all is because only a minority of people living with ALS participate in clinical trials. And so the reasons for this are variable. One of the reasons is that many people are not eligible to participate, either by the time they are diagnosed or by the time they are considering clinical trials, or for a number of other reasons. But eligibility really is a pain point in the community. And so patients have been asking us for a long time, what other options do we have to get access to promising investigational products? So there's no right or wrong answer. There's not only one right answer here, but certainly we became interested because of this demand from patients in a mechanism called expanded access. This is not new. This is not something that the ALS community came up with. This was already present in the regulations. It's an FDA regulated mechanism that's been applied to many different fields of medicine. And it's also sometimes called compassionate use. Specifically, this FDA regulated mechanism that's been present in the regulations, again, for decades, is a pathway for patients with an immediately life-threatening or serious disease or condition to access an investigational product outside of clinical trials if there's no comparable or alternative treatment available. Now, the FDA regulations also categorize the types of protocols that this can fall under. So specifically, EAPs can be given to an individual patient, to intermediate-sized patient populations, or larger populations. Again, this is part of the regulations, and that's what's already in place. Now, there are some requirements, though. Again, obviously, this is only for people who have a serious disease when there's no alternative. We need to make sure, obviously, that the potential benefit justifies the potential risk. And most importantly, especially for a disease like ALS, providing drug should not interfere with clinical trials. So this is very clear in the regulations, and this is the way we're thinking about when we think about EAPs. I would say that the patient community have done tremendous advocacy to really focus on these points. And in addition to advocating for EAPs, they've done a lot of education with the community to make sure that these are not conceived as a substitute for clinical trial enrollment. And so I do want to acknowledge the great work of Sandy Morris, a patient with ALS who has done incredible advocacy in many areas, including EAPs. And she made this slide, and she gave me permission to use it in presentations. Unfortunately, she died just recently, and what she has been dedicating her life to really was ALS advocacy, specifically educating the community about the difference between clinical trials and EAPs. So if people are eligible for clinical trials, absolutely, that should be the way to go for people who are eligible. However, for people who are not eligible for clinical trials, EAPs may be an option. And again, that's in that context, we are thinking about EAPs. Now, we have developed experience with EAPs at our site at the Mass General Hospital. This really started because of patients being interested in it. And so we established the first EAPs at our center as a single center set of protocols in 2018. In 2018, we started literally with one patient. And that program was so successful that soon grew to a number of intermediate-sized EAPs. Cumulatively, we have been providing EAPs under 17 separate protocols for a total of 14 drugs, which have been donated by several manufacturers. And as of right now, we have been enrolling over 160 participants. Now, the main goal of EAPs is to provide access, but they can also be leveraged to collect safety, safety data in broad populations, as well as some clinical data and some biomarkers. Now, we started publishing our experience, and the slide shows our first paper that was just published with our initial learnings from one specific product, the RT01 EAP, where in addition to providing access to this investigational product to a broad patient population that was not eligible for clinical trials, we also learned a lot while doing so in terms of PK and biomarkers for this particular product. And the reason I think this is relevant is because this product then went on to complete phase 2 testing in Europe. And again, that the program is continuing. So our EAP was actually the first time that the drug was given to an ALS population while the phase 2 trial was ongoing. And so we are also working on publishing other programs and our experience with other drugs. But essentially, the common theme here is that we have been gathering some interesting biomarker data for many of these drugs. And certainly, we'll be monitoring safety and clinical data throughout. And again, this is a broad patient population that normally is not studied in clinical trials. Now, obviously, EAPs require resources both at the site level and for program oversight. So we obviously need to devote resources in terms of research coordinators, nurses, PI, research center supplies as applicable. And then we do have a responsibility when we sponsor EAPs to monitor safety. So we certainly need to make sure that we have enough resources for medical monitoring. And because we also want to learn about the EAPs, we want to again collect the data in a systematic way. We have a system for capturing the data. Obviously, we need to report to the regulators, etc. So these are sort of, you know, the pieces of the puzzle that are needed to run the program safely. Now, since then, since our first experience in 2018 and to present, as a single centers EAP group, we decided to leverage the existing Healy ALS platform trial that we spoke about earlier to offer EAPs and more sites, not just our site, but trying to broaden this concept to other sites so that we could get closer to where people live. So the slide here shows that so far we have implemented 3 EAPs. Each is an intermediate size protocol. They have been deployed at 10 sites, and we selected the sites with attention to geography to make sure that there will be geographic access, not just in one area of the country, but throughout the United States. And so far, we have included 85 participants. These have been mostly funded by philanthropy. We studied drug donated by the manufacturers. And again, the same theme is, you know, what can we gain? What can we learn from this concept? And we've been collecting safety and clinical data with some limited biomarker data, again, to continue to learn about the effect of these drugs in a broader patient population. And philanthropy really has been an amazing partnership with so many in the community that have been helping our EAP companion to the platform trial. And I want to highlight among the many groups that have been providing substantial support, also the Tech versus ALS initiative that recently allowed us to bring the EAP concept to the Jefferson site in Philadelphia. Now, I do want to acknowledge Amylyx Pharmaceuticals. We are not the only ones at MGH that are doing EAPs, but Amylyx was ahead of the times once again, and they did start a large EAP in parallel to their late stage trial, as Dr. Timmons just described, that was started in 2022, early this year. And this is a screenshot from a poster that was presented at the MDA conference. So again, the main learning is that it is possible to have large EAPs that work in parallel to ALS clinical trials, and specifically in the case of Amylyx, that was the Phoenix phase 3 trial. So again, the idea here is, can we develop models that can improve access, inclusion, participation, while we're also testing drugs in the context of formal clinical trials? Now, and this is the next step. Again, our thinking about all of this continues to evolve. This is a relatively new type of study in ALS. And so the opportunity came with a new law, Act for ALS, that was signed at the end of December of 2021. Now, the law, Act for ALS, has different sections and calls for several initiatives and strategic partnerships, both at the FDA, the NIH, and in partnership with different stakeholders. There is one specific section of the law that allows for grants for research on treatments for ALS. And so specifically, they calls for, there was a grant process that was initiated by the NIH earlier this year to allow for the establishment of intermediate-sized EAPs for the treatment of ALS. And so with my colleagues, Dr. Babu, Dr. Barry, we were fortunate to receive the first such awards from the NIH and NINDS. This was just announced last week. And so we were able to, we will be able to launch a relatively large EAP in parallel to the platform trial for Trialose, which is one of the drugs that's been tested in the platform trial right now. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Trialose and why this particular grant mechanism and the Act for ALS is allowing us to do something that we couldn't do with previous studies that were smaller. So first of all, which drug are we using for this EAP? We are using Trialose, that is, oh, I think people need to mute, or maybe Jen, maybe can you help with that? Thank you. So, oh, thank you so much.
Yep.
So Trialose is one of the drugs that is being tested in the Healy ALS platform trial. We mentioned that earlier. It's developed by Silos Therapeutics. It's a disaccharide that is administered IV. It's been shown to penetrate muscle and brain. And when tested in vivo, it had positive outcomes in the SOD1 mouse model of ALS. So based on those promising preclinical data, the drug was selected for inclusion into the platform trial. And specifically, the regimen E, is now enrolling. The mechanism of action of Trialose is thought to involve protein stabilization and enhancement of autophagy. So again, we were excited to be testing the drug formally in the platform trial as regimen E, but then the Act for ALS and this new opportunity for funding from the NIH also gave us the opportunity to broaden access to this molecule while we're testing the molecule in the platform trial. So specifically, Drs. Babu, Barry, and myself recently received an NIH grant to be able to give the drug to a total of 70 participants from 25 sites. So thinking about the evolution of our, thinking about EAPs, we started with one center, single center EAP program in 2018. Then we expanded to 10 sites in 2021, and now we're expanding to 25 sites. So again, the idea is to help people get access to this drug or other drugs through innovative ways of doing research. Now, the funding specifically, the NIH grant that's funded by the Act for ALS also calls for specific research objectives. And so here we're starting to use EAPs to do what we were doing before, to monitor safety, but also to have more robust and systematic collection of outcomes. Specifically, we are testing the biological impact of Trialose as measured by neurofilament light levels, and we're also measuring clinical efficacy signals. Now, I do want to mention that just as a segue to the previous presentation, as the field continues to develop new statistical ways of comparing data to natural history cohorts, that's exactly the type of work that can be done in the context of an EAP. In other words, we can measure functional outcomes and survival compared to natural history studies that have already been completed or are still ongoing, to essentially have a virtual control so that we can learn more about this particular drug, and we can do so in a broad population that typically is not included in clinical trials. So to summarize all of this, obviously clinical trials are essential to develop new treatments for all people with ALS, and there is no substitute for that. However, expanded access protocols can be a way to provide access to drugs for people who are not eligible for clinical trials, and we can certainly do it while clinical trials are ongoing. Importantly, the data collected in EAPs can supplement clinical development programs. And specifically, we can collect safety, clinical, and biomarker data in a population that normally would be excluded from trials. And the ALS community has also created mechanisms to run EAPs in parallel to late-stage trials. This is important so that we can do both at the same time. And the Act for ALS provides a funding mechanism for that. So with that, I stop, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. Really, it's a way that I think kind of the community, the trial community has changed dramatically over the last few years. Thank you for summarizing it. One of the things that I guess, you touched on it. You touched on it and you were sort of overt about it, but I'd love to just explore a little more how EAPs coexist with trials and what the impacts are, not only for people with the disease and creating opportunities, but at the site level, how do sites sort of incorporate this into their workflow?
Yeah, that's a great question. So certainly we need funding and resources for running EAPs in parallel to clinical trials, both at the site level and at the coordination center level. So one way that this could happen at the site level is that when patients come in and they're interested in a trial, if they are eligible for the trial, obviously they can be enrolled in that trial. If the screen fail, or we know upfront that they won't be eligible for that trial, EAPs provide an opportunity to still keep them engaged in research while learning or collecting minimal data, depending on the funding. Could be more data, like now we have more funding mechanisms to allow for more robust data collection so that we can also learn from their experience. Certainly that means that we need to have more resources at the site level.
I think that's a key point, and it's something that I guess I would say we often look to the oncology world for kind of what is the next thing, platform trials, but EAPs as well, and having networks of well-supported centers to do this work also comes from that. There are kind of a few questions in here about mixed in here about EAPs and the plans for the EAP that was funded through the ALS, the Act for ALS money. We're incredibly excited to get going on that EAP with Silos of Trehalose. One question is, is there some data from the current platform trial that led to selection of that for an EAP? And I'll start by saying there isn't data, from an ongoing trial. It's a blinded trial. We don't have results from that. There are no sort of interim results that we're holding on to that show us that it works or something. I think that was one of the questions that came. But really that selection is based on the same things that made it a wonderful candidate for the platform trial, which is it's promise as a therapy and the development that's gone on to this point. And so, I just would underline that. Sabrina, do you want to add anything to that?
No, absolutely. You said it so well. I mean, this was the selection of this particular drug for the EAP was like a regular NIH grant. So it was submitted for scientific review, and the selection was based on the scientific rationale for the drug. And this is sort of a similar process, although again, in this case, it was an NIH driven process as the selection process for putting drugs in a trial or in the platform trial specifically. So I think Merit said it in another context, if it's good enough for a clinic, if a drug is good enough for a clinical trial, it's good enough for an EAP, right? So again, the idea here is to create these two parallel mechanisms so that we can learn as much as possible about the same drug.
Right. Very nice. Thank you very much. It's been just a wonderful morning. We've mostly stayed, more or less on time here. We're a little bit over, but for an academic conference, we're doing all right. We're going to pause here. I think we have a lunch break.